So hello everyone, again my name is Alin Suciu and I wish you a warm welcome on behalf of the entire Coptic Old Testament team in Göttingen. This is the fourth part of our monthly lecture series, Material and Written Culture of Christian Egypt, organized by the digital edition of the Coptic Old Testament, a 21-year-long project based at the Göttingen Academy, and the Seminar for Egyptology and Coptic Studies at the University of Göttingen. We are offering today a mini symposium dedicated to Coptic Christianity during the Muslim or Arabic period. Our next speaker, Febe Armanios, will talk about the Copts during the Ottoman rule, a period when the Coptic community already severely shrank. Febe teaches at the Middlebury College in Vermont. She earned her PhD at the Ohio State University with a brilliant thesis precisely on the situation of the Copts during the Ottoman period, which was eventually published with Oxford University Press in 2011. Febe demonstrated in her book that the Coptic community faced two serious challenges during the Ottoman period, and none of them can be associated with the Muslim rule. Febe showed that a serious threat for the Christian Egyptian clergy came from the newly emerged Coptic civil elite formed of prosperous people who became de facto leaders of the Coptic community. And the second threat came from the Catholic missionaries who established missions in Egypt during the 17th century and were looking for converts among the local Christian community, something which obviously must have placed some considerable strains on the Coptic clergy. Please, Febe.
All right, great. Well, I am so delighted to join you today and to follow a talk by my wonderful friend, Mark Swanson, whose scholarship and collegiality I have really long treasured. So it's a pleasure to be here with you, Mark. And I really want to thank my colleague, Alin Suciu, for generously inviting me to be here and part of this incredible lecture series. So it's also really nice to be speaking about a book that I wrote 10 years ago, which to me personally, seems like a really long time ago, especially that I've moved on to publish about very, very different topics since that time. I've moved on quite a bit from the Ottoman period in my work and doing a lot more contemporary work, some of it related to Copts, some of it not. But this project is still very close to my heart, and rest assured, I do hope that some of my future research on food within the Coptic community and among Christians in the Middle East will also explore food traditions in the Ottoman period among the Coptic Christians. So I will return to this period momentarily, but it has been a while. My paper today offers an overview, and kind of this was previewed in the introduction, about Coptic religious life, practices, and communal dynamics in the Ottoman period, from the beginning of the conquest in 1517 until that roughly arbitrary date of 1798, which is the date of the French invasion. I'm going to argue that to learn more about this still little understood period, we have to find ways to move beyond the challenges of limited archival sources, and we should try to question very restrictive and narrow paradigms that continue to dominate this field. Looking in unexpected places for information, like I tried to do by looking at Coptic author textual sources, yields promising results, especially when it comes to the study of Coptic religious life in this period. So even though it's been 10 years since my book was published, the study of Ottoman era Copts remains still a highly understudied field. And maybe we could talk more in the Q&A about why some people think that is. I think that this is partly due to the topic's many challenges. For one, scholars trying to study this period and this community are immediately faced with the task of trying to debunk prevalent stereotypes that have long plagued the field. There are all these popular myths from works in the mid to late 20th century. Many of them are authored by the community, members of the community, that try to represent the Ottoman era as one of cultural, moral, and spiritual decline among the Copts. Some scholars even suggested that the Ottoman period was especially persecutory for the Copts as compared to other time periods, which is a bit astonishing considering how poorly the Copts did at the end of the Mamluk period. And still yet, other narratives suggest that only through the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798 were Copts and all Egyptians liberated and able to enter, quote, a modern age with all the deceptively positive implications of that term. For historians, the limited sources available about Copts in this period can make it difficult to fully challenge these stereotypes. And in fact, they sometimes reinforce the idea that Copts were deeply marginalized within Ottoman society. For example, aside from scattered mentions by Egyptian chroniclers from the Ottoman era, like Ibn Iyas, al-Damardashi, and al-Jabarti, there are actually very few references to Copts in the Muslim literary sources of this period, especially compared to the Mamluk era. At times, and in contrast to their earlier visibility in Muslim chronicles, one wonders if Copts had simply disappeared from the consciousness of Muslim Egyptian writers. Sigils, or court records, which constitute an important source for non-Muslim history in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, could potentially illuminate certain legal and economic aspects of Coptic life. But sigil-based research is still at an early stage for Ottoman Egypt, and from what we can tell so far, these records, which are filtered through the pen of the Muslim judicial and bureaucratic establishment, make only scattered references to Coptic life and provide few details about Coptic religious worldviews, if that's one's interest, and that was what was my interest. Copts are also mostly absent in the Ottoman imperial archives. Unlike Armenians and Greeks who had active patriarchates right in the heart of the capital city of Istanbul, Copts were primarily governed by local power holders in Egypt, governors, ulama, military households, or by their own lay and religious communal elders. Consequently, the community rarely provoked the interest of sultans or their deputies. I should say too that many sources, original sources produced by Copts, which are both helpful and problematic. Sorry, I switched too soon. I should also add one more thing, that many sources produced by Copts, which are both helpful and problematic in their own way, remain until today a bit inaccessible. We still, for example, don't know the expansiveness of historical records of Coptic authored documents during the Ottoman period, either religious or legal, as many of them continue to exist in untapped and closed archives in Egypt. The professions of the most prominent Ottoman era Copts does reinforce a sense that Copts were a bit more marginalized and isolated than other Christians in the Ottoman world. Coptic lay elites, many of them known as archons or erekhina, were employed in Ottoman Egypt's bureaucratic and military infrastructure, mostly as scribes or accountants. Meanwhile, for other non-Muslims in Egypt and in Ottoman territories, the capitulation system provided access to other lucrative opportunities. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the capitulations gave enormous power to Europeans who received these official documents from the Ottoman sultans known as berats. These berats granted them favorable trade status in the empire. European businessmen and consular representatives transferred these berats to local Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, and Jews who served as translators or commercial agents on behalf of their European patrons. Berats were quite coveted because they allowed their holders to pay reduced taxes compared to fellow native Muslims and non-Muslim merchants. While there's little evidence to suggest that Copts received or were denied berats, they were likely restricted in their ability to participate in international trade. Unlike Egypt's Jews, Greeks, Armenians, and Syrian Catholics who were connected to co-religionists throughout the Mediterranean basin, there were few Coptic communities established outside of Egypt. And moreover, Copts, according to some scholars, struggled to gather enough capital to acquire tax farming rights over the custom stations. Historian of Egypt Andre Ramon's research showed that few Copts, if any, worked in the commercial sector, and by implications, few received berats. Also, many Copts, be they clergy or laity, appear to have shunned altogether close connections with Europeans in the Ottoman period, especially with the French, who came to represent the Catholic Church, an ideological rival to the Coptic establishment. Despite these variations in the Coptic experience, we do see surprising parallels and connections to the lives and the experiences of other Ottoman non-Muslims. The rise of Coptic elites, for example, those archons, mirror developments among the Greek elites of Istanbul, the Phanariates, or the Armenian elites called the Amiras. Also, texts produced by Copts during this period share a lot of commonalities with those written by Christians throughout the entire empire. Coptic neo-martyrdom texts from this period share a lot with their Bulgarian and Greek correlates. Manuscripts on different religious traditions like the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem that Copts themselves authored show how they were connecting their community to a larger ritual that included and was predicated upon the presence of other Ottoman Christians. Sermons written by Coptic clerical elders like those of Bishop Yuseb and Patriarch Ioannis, which I'll talk about later in the late 18th century, detail the effects of the encounter with Catholic missionaries and how it forced Copts to redefine their identity. Altogether, that is, the Copto-Arabic corpus of this period, theological treatises, miracles, hagiographies, chronicles, and sermons, produced within the church's auspices, if not always written by clergy, has been long neglected or dismissed by most scholars of this period, and yet it does help situate Coptic history within its proper Ottoman context. So in the remainder of today's talk, I want to discuss how these manuscripts, read in conjunction with other sources, can open up new ways of thinking about Ottoman Coptic history, ways that could further situate the Copts experience within regional developments, and which will also highlight the importance of religious practices and communal dynamics in this context. After the Ottoman conquest of 1517, and actually this came up in the Q&A for Mark, Egypt becomes, rather than the capital, the center of an empire, but now a periphery, a province of an empire. And the conquest, of course, was led by Sultan Selim II. And with the trauma of the context, as many scholars argued, including the late Michael Winter, it seems that Egyptians, all of them, engaged in a kind of self-introspection, a spiritual introspection, brought about by a sense of malaise, as they dealt with the military rampage, plague outbreaks, and political strife that came upon Egypt at that time. Once Ottoman rule was established, governors were regularly deposed or murdered. Violence in Egypt's urban and rural areas persisted for decades, and the chaos and sense of devastation were compounded by the Ottoman practice of forced exile, or sürgün, in which the Ottomans carted off manuscripts, talented individuals to the capital city, Istanbul. In this process, several Coptic notables, we are told in the sources, were taken away to Istanbul, their exile likely a very disturbing development for a small community that depended on its best and brightest, especially in times of crisis. These hardships may have reinforced Egyptians, and specifically Copts' desire for closer bonds with the spiritual. People turned to religion to cope and survive. Historically, these challenges, plagues, disease, violence, led rich and poor to make public expressions of remorse and piety, as the afflicted thought they were cursed by God. Ottoman Egypt saw a revitalization, as other scholars have argued, in religious rituals, traditions, and ceremonies as a way of dealing with daily hardships. Under Mamluk rule, Copts had faced waves of conversions and attacks against church property and life, from which they were still recovering in the early 16th century. After the Ottoman conquest, Copts must have wondered how strictly would the sultans and their deputies govern non-Muslim subjects? How would they enforce existing laws? I am certain that Coptic leaders considered the future of their diminished, smaller community in trying to deal with new challenges, and their impulse for self-protection would intensify over the coming years, especially following Catholic attempts at unification with the Coptic Church in the 16th and 17th centuries, and during direct encounters with Catholic missionaries in the 18th century. In my book, I argued that lay and clerical elders preserved communal traditions and supported forms of religious expression that unified fellow believers, that demarcated the boundaries of their community as a way of dealing with these challenges. The public veneration of martyrs drew on age-old rituals, discouraged conversion to Islam and later to Catholicism, and fulfilled the community's needs for local Egyptian heroes. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem, on the other hand, encouraged Coptic believers to boldly parade their religion in Cairo streets and Egypt's roadways. This, no doubt, imparted a sense of pride and communal cohesion. In many ways, Copts didn't have to work hard to invent or imagine the boundaries of their community. In classical Islamic legal understandings, as many of you know who are in the audience, religious groups were separated into Muslim believers and dhimmis, or protected peoples. The latter were required to pay the jizya, a poll tax, in exchange for being allowed to practice a restricted version of their faith. In Ottoman Egypt, Copts were the largest non-Muslim community, but they were still fairly small, constituting at various estimates roughly 4 to 5% of the population in the 17th and 18th centuries. Muslim and Christian texts from this period, including chronicles and court records, use specific terminology to refer to a Copt, speaking of them as al-Nasrani al-Yaqubi, the Nazarene Christian Jacobite, or al-Nasrani al-Qibti. So being a Copt, if I can say that, therefore, was really a normative existence in this period and not invented, not newly invented in this cultural context. Beyond nomenclature and legal status, the Coptic identity was further nurtured within the auspices of the church, within the epicenter of social, cultural, and at times political life. Copts had active churches in most urban centers and modest parishes in rural areas. The community regularly assembled there for liturgies, but also to celebrate religious feasts and weddings. A desire for fellowship and spiritual comfort motivated Coptic men and women to participate in church services, and within poorer communities, people came also to seek charity and comfort from clerical or lay elders. The church was obligated so far as it could to alleviate people's suffering, and in this way, it held enormous sway over the lives of congregants. Historically, the private space of the church was important since under Islamic rule, Copts and non-Muslims faced many restrictions in their public religious life. And we know these, they were generally limited in repairing churches or ringing church bells and so on. But these legal codes were open to the arbitrary interpretation of regional and local rulers, and non-Muslims, including Copts, had to be prepared for leniency or rigidity in their enforcement. And in fact, despite all of these restrictions that many of us are familiar with under Islamic rule, during the 17th and 18th centuries, Coptic laity promoted a very visible and occasionally very public religious resurgence. They supported multiple religious practices that helped keep their faith alive and helped the boundaries of their community remain more demarcated. The increased articulation of a Coptic identity paralleled the rise of a wealthy group of Coptic leaders, of those archons I mentioned earlier. Throughout history, periods of prosperity among Coptic lay elites often translated into revenue for the church, tangible financial investment within the community, and greater power for the laity. But specifically, in the 17th and 18th centuries, Coptic elites were able to secure highly lucrative positions within Egypt's military households. And with their newfound prosperity, they funded, managed, and oversaw a Coptic renewal in architecture, literary, and artistic realms. Paralleling their growing political power, lay leaders increasingly managed Coptic religious life, supporting church and monastic renovations, iconography, illuminated manuscripts, and the revival of certain religious rites like the preparation of the Holy Mayroon and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In this way, the archons enhanced the religious cultural profile of their community, augmented their own power as leaders, and acted as intermediaries between their community and governing authorities. Religious life was relevant in this time, not only for pious consumption, but also for its political implications. And patterns of lay authority as tied to religious life are very clear in the historical records. For example, one scribe uses the title of Al-Mawla Al-Ra'is Al-Din Al-Orthodoxi, which is Lord Head of the Orthodox Faith, to describe a lay patron of one religious manuscript dating to 1609. And when the Jesuit missionary Claude Sicard planned a visit to Upper Egypt in 1714, the town of Niqada, he relied upon letters of introduction from a Cairo-based archon named, a well-known archon named Girgis Abu Mansur al-Tuhi, whom Sicard called the most accredited of Copts in Cairo and patron of Niqada's bishop. Incidentally, only decades before, these sorts of letters would have been given by the Coptic patriarch himself, or at least by other bishops. And about 5 years after Sicard's visit, Patriarch Boutros VI fully authorized, this was 1718 to 1726, fully authorized the Archon Lutfullah Abu Yusuf to select a new bishop over Ethiopia. Now, there were certainly collaborative partnerships between lay and clerical elders in the Ottoman period, who for a long time saw working together as critical for Coptic survival. But struggles over who had the right to define the boundaries of the community and in turn to lead the community intensified over time and were spawned by new external threats beginning in the early 18th century with increased Catholic missionary activity in Egypt. At that time, Coptic clergy launched a religious reform program and began to reestablish themselves as true leaders. In the process, they offered increasingly refined expressions of a Coptic identity. They also began to crack down on popular religious practices among the laity, challenging their prestigious leadership. These practices included smoking, drinking, misery, gluttony, among others. But how did we get here? Well, up till the early 18th century, Catholic missionaries had only won a small number of converts in Egypt. I don't have a picture of them in Egypt, so I chose one from Ethiopia. But they'd become noticeably more aggressive in their tactics. For instance, Franciscans demanded in the early 18th century that new Coptic converts destroy their old books, and many missionaries ridiculed and misrepresented the Eastern rites, traditions, and customs. However, they were to be confronted by both clergy and laity in defense of the native Coptic Orthodox community in assertive and even extortionist ways. In the late 18th century, in 1778, a European traveler to Upper Egypt, Sonini, confirmed how some Orthodox archons' allegiance to their faith resulted in persecution of new Coptic Catholic converts. And this quote is worth kind of going through. I'm sorry, it's long. He says, among the number of Coptic inhabitants of Tahta, there were several Catholics. The Copts, it is well known, are one of those sects in which the Roman Church condemns as heretical. I frequently visited the most respectable among them, and to my great satisfaction, I there found their vicar, an Egyptian who had passed 15 years in a seminary in Rome. He spoke Latin and Italian pretty well, and I took pleasure in conversing with a man whom I considered as a European. He informed me that the Egyptians attached to the Roman Church were cruelly harassed and tormented by those of their numerous countrymen who followed the heresy with which they were infected, and that their most determined and implacable persecutor was the very man, the Coptic archon Morcos, in whose house I resided. Enjoying the confidence of the Kashif, he thence arrogated to himself an authority to impose extortions on those of his nation who had adopted a religious doctrine preached by foreigners, in consequence of which they were often obliged to collect considerable sums in order to avert the effects of his animosity. Here we can see that the Coptic Orthodox archons were trying to ensure that their community persisted as Egypt's dominant Christian sect, and that they, not the Catholic leadership, would be recognized as its leaders. Moreover, their position signaled to their Muslim patrons, their bosses, that Copts were dependable, that they were autonomous and resilient against foreign pressure. This, in effect, strengthened their trustworthiness and further ingratiated them to local patrons. On the other hand, using church pulpits to encourage a moral revival, Coptic clerical leaders, especially Patriarch Ioannis the 18th and Euseb of Achmim and Gerga, and they're both from the late 18th, early 19th century, there's some overlap with early 19th century, warned fellow Copts from converting to Catholicism and adopting the much hated Frankish identity, as they called it. Before printing presses, of course, as we know, which were not widely available in the Middle East until the 19th century, public oratory was one of the most effective means to shape popular opinion. And by the 18th century, missionaries had learned local dialects and converted native preachers to Catholicism. They had become very proficient at giving effective and rousing sermons that won over a greater number of converts. Copts were forced to adapt and become more effective orators. As they preached against foreign and native Catholics, clergy reminded believers that the Coptic identity was made up of two parts, faith, iman, and race or nation, jins. These parts were inseparable, and both would recede if Copts converted to Catholicism. Clergymen blamed Franks for creating intracommunal dissent and for promoting heterodox practices which weaken authentic Coptic traditions. And by defining what it meant to be a Copt in contrast to a Frank, by outlining what behaviors, mores, habits, and values define Copticness, these clergy rallied believers to renew their faith under their own leadership. The religious renewal that had been mostly sponsored by archons since the late 17th century had focused on the arts, building, architecture, manuscript production, and religious rites. But through sermons and preaching, the clergy led their own renewal, a moral one, as they sought to standardize church traditions on everything from marriage to confession, fasting, prayer, and popular religion, ultimately to lead a reform program that is unique to their own area of expertise. Tensions between Orthodox laity and clergy, between the archons and the higher clerical elites, played out at church pulpits. Clergy frequently, if not exclusively, focused on immoral habits of the Coptic lay elders, particularly on the excessive revelry that took place during martyrs' feasts and at weddings. Bishop Euseb, for example, derided these decadent celebrations. He cautioned against the arrogance of revelers who splurged on food, on drink, and entertainment while their impoverished brothers and sisters languished. And he was concerned about the public image of the archons, of the Copts within broader society. For Bishop Euseb, moreover, lewd practices went hand in hand with stinginess towards the poor. Charity had become expected from the archons, and their lavish and wasteful spending at the expense of ordinary Christian persons was highly condemned. In one combined critique of injustice and immorality, Euseb suggests that revelers were more willing to fund lewd entertainment than to help a needy person. I have heard on the days of your weddings you participate in the games which are inappropriate to the believers. You invite to your weddings adulterous women. You defile your eyes with adulterous sights. You defile your ears with words inappropriate among believers. You savor there the women's depraved songs, and then you adorn them with gifts and money. And if a Christian person came upon you at that moment, asked you for something in the name of Christ, not only do you throw him out, but you also hurl curses at him. Tell me, my beloved children, is this a habit that you found in the laws of our church? I believe that you have learned them from those who are outside of our faith, because such things should not be mentioned among the faithful in Christ. So the origins of these habits, as you can see, lay outside the community. You have learned them from outside the faith and outside the culture. While they may have lacked the archon's financial and political clout, clergy in the late 18th century then used preaching and religious sermons, traditionally clerical domain, to express their moralizing ideals and to define a Coptic Orthodox communal identity. This rhetoric wasn't necessarily innovative. Some other Christians in the empire were also employing similar sermons against Catholic threats. But importantly, what we find in this period is an urgent task to outline the Coptic community's boundaries, moral and religious. We see this happening by both clergy through preaching and the standardization of faith, and by archons through multiple acts of religious patronage. Okay, so to conclude, the Ottoman period has been long dismissed as unproductive for all Egyptians, and particularly for Copts, but the era did see a resurgent interest in religious patronage and revival among Copts, especially in the realm of textual and manuscript production. If you look at, and I'm sure many of you have, the catalogs of various European and North American libraries and other catalogs of Egyptian monastic and church holdings, you can see only but a small glimpse of the prolific output that took place in this period. Now, even though original new novel treatises were few, but the sheer abundance of documents indicates that there was an enduring Coptic religious literature supported by a strong belief in preserving a communal heritage and in defining communal boundaries. It ensured that the community was ensuring, and its elders were ensuring, that funds continue to exist and be preserved for supporting these kinds of conservation projects. So it is my hope that future work will be able to access and look at more of these documents for the study of this time period. And I thank you very much.